specifically for Naiji and those who want to learn about Naiji. Okay, so what we're going to go over here is the human design, the basic configuration of the psyche, the major relationships, but how it works for being a Naiji. Well, the first thing is you have directive and adaptive mojos. As a Naiji, I am a directive mojo. If you're a Naiji, you are a directive mojo. Why is that? Well, it's because your top two powers, being a Naiji, are speculation of Nai, which are subjective, interpretive perceptions. These perceptions give a vision of a future that could or should unfold if you did certain things, if you understood certain things. So it has a compulsion to it. We'll get to that later on. I think you've seen the other things, the powerful lows, such as visionary drive. So seeing that vision and your place in it, and the fact that if you walk this road, you get here, and that you need to do that. This gives a structure automatically, an imperative, an agenda. It gives you something that you need to be doing. Next, Ji, the second power, that's the discernment power. Those are objective, values-based discernments. That means they're concerned with the way the tribe is doing things for all times, for right now, for next week. So it has elements of time in it. It has elements of quantitative measurements, such as how many people are in the group, how cohesive is the group, how smart is the group, what's the group doing, how far along in their travels are they, how far along in their development are they. And so it's very much oriented to structure and beginning, middle, and end, and closure. So it's values-based, but it is directive. So as a Naiji, that is why we are directive, because those two powers are the most dominant, the most pervasive in our psyche. As a Naiji, we are subjective mojos. Why is that? Well, the Naiji, we have Nai, Ji, Zai, and Vi. And what that means is our first and third powers. The source power, first power, Nai, and the third power, offside of Zai. Those outrank first place and third place. They outrank Ji, tandem, second place, and Vi, fourth place, polar. So we have what we call the double barrel, which is when you're using both of the front powers, or double tower, when you're using both of the back powers. For myself, it's always going to be easier and more native being a Naiji, as well for all Naiji, when it goes to using the back two powers, the Nai and the Zai. And this comes out in various elements when it comes to reading cues, because the physiology of the face will show that. The fact that I have first place Nai with third place Zai, that makes my back half weighted heavier than my front. Perceiver or discerner. As you mentioned, there's the two corridors. We have the perception corridor and we have the discernment corridor. My source power, Naiji source power, is Nai, which is perception. So that puts the perception corridor on first. It gives it higher ranking, it gives it precedence. Then up here is Ji, the tandem power. That's the first discernment for the Naiji in their peak pathway, and therefore that means that they discern second after the perceptions. All the mojos have two perceptions in their conscious hierarchy, and those are going to be one of which is a interpretive perception power and one is a literal. So for Naiji, it's Nai, Ji, Zai, Vi. So Vi is the literal perception power that the Naiji uses, and it's fourth place. It's the polar power, as opposed to the first place or source power of Nai. So that puts the interpretive power ahead of the literal. So as Naiji, that is why we are interpretive. For example, when you ask yourself, are you interpretive? There can be different reasons for why you're interpretive. You could be based on Nai. It could also be based on Ni. And then also you could actually have those powers in the first or second positions. All those things would mean that you are interpretive. But for Naiji, it's because we use Nai and we use Nai above Vi. That's what makes us interpretive. Logic-based or values-based. As a Naiji, we are values-based mojo, and that's because in a discernment corridor for any mojo, you're going to need a logic-based discernment and a values-based discernment. But one must take precedence, one must have higher ranking. So for us, Naiji, it's Ji, with Xi. And so this internal Chile logical compass is what modulates or suppresses in the face, we mentioned earlier, the expression of Xi. But the Xi is more powerful in the Nai-Xi. It's the second place power and is the first place of the discernment powers. And so therefore, in any kind of hierarchical operation for the Nai-Xi, the Xi takes precedence. The Xi outranks the Xi, and thus makes us values-based. In order to have what we call basic functionality of the psyche, you need to address 4 considerations. These 4 considerations can be addressed with one half of the psyche. They are not actually done that way. You need the whole psyche, which we'll get to in a second. But with just your strong side, a mojo will be able to address the 4 considerations, which are objectivity, subjectivity, perception, and discernment. So for the Nai-Xi, Nai is a power of perception and it is subjective. So that takes care of those 2 considerations. And then up here, Xi takes care of objectivity and also of discernment. So that's how the Nai-Xi takes care of the first 4 considerations of, basic functionality for the psyche. Now for full functionality, to be mature, you need to have all 4 conscious powers working. So Nai, Xi, Xi, and V. Now why is that? That's because in addition to the 4 considerations, there's also the 4 priorities. And these are the worldview map, or the agenda. Up here we have the dynamics mover, or the articulator. Back here we have the compass bearings, or the equilibrium. And up here we have the stimulus register, or the drinking in of the environment. Now all mojos must address those, but they can use different powers. For Nai-Xi, when it comes to the worldview is done with Nai, as opposed to Vi, which is memories. Both of these would make a model for which you could plan things on, you could base things on, you could use as a map for navigating life. But for us, the Nai-Xi, we use speculation for that worldview. Next, all the mojos must have something in this quadrant. They must have an objective discernment. For Nai-Xi, it is Xi, which is the objective values-based discernments. So when it comes to moving dynamics, for noting how dynamics change, Nai-Xi are going to be naturally tuned to people and how people move, why they move, and the structure and sequence of that. Dynamics, compass bearings. Back here on the back right, all the mojos must have a compass bearing power, which is Xi or Xi. For the Nai-Xi, Xi is the compass power. That is a internal situational logic, a personal kind of logic, and it addresses the free-form kind of discernments that a psyche needs to have. A way of keeping equilibrium under stress, under information coming in, impact coming in, good or bad, but it reacts accordingly, and a psyche needs a way of doing that. And for the Nai-Xi, Xi is the power they use for that. Finally, all mojos must have a stimulus register, a way of drinking in the environment. For the Nai-Xi, they use Xi back here for the compass, and they use V for bringing in stimulus in the environment. And that's going to be 5 senses, detailed information, perceptions from the environment. The thing I want to note before I move on is that these 4 powers answer those 4 imperatives or roles or functionalities in the psyche. But those functionalities, those roles, must have a sequence to them. Otherwise, all 4 of them would go at an equal power, equal ranking. It would be a jam. So, as mentioned in some other filmings, you have what we call shades of me. So, Nai, Xi, Xi, V, those 4 powers, there are 4 mojos that have the same 4 powers, but it's a different, we call priority, a different ranking. What is that? The first ranked power is called the source power. The second ranked power is the tandem. Third ranked power is offside, and the 4th ranked power is the polar. Now for Nai-Xi, Nai is the source power, and it's important to note this. For Nai-Xi, Nai answers the worldview. It answers how the worldview is constructed. It's constructed predominantly with visions, speculations, conceptualizing, synergizing. But being the source power, it means that that worldview is the supreme force in the psyche. For the Naiji, that way of seeing things, that worldview, is the thing that informs and makes all the other powers move. They come off of that. They take their cue, their lead from that. Next, Ji is the tandem power. So Ji answers the priority of dynamics mover, but being in the tandem position, it means for a Naiji, it is subordinate to the Nai. However, it is on the strong side, it is the second power, and it is the first of the discernments. So it is very strong, it is very natural for us, and it is core to the way our world is structured. Information comes in our information perception corridor, first and foremost through Nai. That's important. And then the discernment corridor, where structure comes from, first and foremost is Ji. So that is the foundation of how everything else comes. Everything else sort of colors and amplifies and adds sophistication to that. All the other 6 powers that we possess. Next, over here we have offside Zai. So Zai is the internal logic. It answers the priority of compass bearings, of keeping equilibrium. But it's also in the offside position, which means it is lower ranked as a discernment than Ji. It is also lower ranked as a subjective power than Nai. And so that will never change. Even though I may develop very, very strong Zai, that doesn't change its position here. Its job is to help curb and discipline and mature the dynamics of Ji, and to help calibrate and fine-tune the model, the world of Nai. That is for a Nai-Ji, that is the role that Zai performs there. So as mentioned before, if you want to know any power, truly you have to understand it, all 16 mojos, because the power in its total form does 16 things in unison within the collective, and that's what the power is doing for all humans. So for the Nai-Ji, that's what it does for us. It helps out the Nai to calibrate it, to give it structure, and it helps to also rein in the structural elements of Ji that can be problematic. It's supposed to counsel it. The polar V. The V power is the literal perceptions, the 5 senses, visceral experience, aesthetic experience, and so on. And for the Nai-Ji, they have V as the 4th power. That means it's going to have a bit of a fetish quality, meaning that it's difficult to have a normal view of it. It's an altered state. You're going to have a tendency to avoid doing that, or to do it very, very well. All the mojos share that their polar power is something that they don't want to do casually. They tend to not want to do it, or if they're going to do it, they want to do it well and they want to win. You don't like to take losses on that because you don't have the energy. Like for Nai-Ji, you can put out 100 speculations and maybe some of them come in, some of them don't, but you can always make a bunch more. But for us, putting out kinetic energy, engaging in visceral experience, that can actually shut down the rest of the processes. And so therefore, in the way the Nai-Ji is configured, it has a more supportive role. Although in other mojos, it can be much higher. And so before I move on, I'll just highlight that all of these powers could be used as a source power. It could work that way. It could be Nai with Ji to Zai to V, but it could also be Ji, Nai, V, Zai. It could also be Zai, V, Nai, Ji, or V, Zai, Ji, Nai. But you'll be able to tell when reading the differences because the physiology will not be the same. The ranking changes that, and that is just fundamental to the way you're built inwardly, to the way you're built outwardly. I'm getting a mojo reading right now. That'll be the next week in 5 years after this. But simply why you're going to be able to see certain things. Because Nai and Ji are the top 2 powers, those are the perceptions and the discernments that feel most comfortable, are the most energizing, make a Nai-Ji feel confident, heroic. They're rewarding, they're validating to your innate being, your natural heroic state. So you gain momentum from doing them. There's a sureness that comes with them. As you do what your psyche was built to do, you'll be able to do it easily, readily, and there's a level of mastery that comes quicker than using powers that are not native to you. And also a higher top end. There's just no way around that. Those who have a source power are going to be able to use it longer and deeper than those who have it lower in their priority. So for Nai-Ji, momentum comes from that, and modulation comes from Zai and Vi. The right brain, the adaptive, the freeform powers is how Nai-Ji modulate themselves. So structured, directive things, even though we're more subjective in nature, still the thoughts have a form to them. They have an imperative, a desire to inquire, to figure out what is going on. And so that's very structured. So you can be a very structured person and actually be a very inward person. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Oh, just to highlight that these modulations, this is the momentum side for Nai-Ji, this is the modulation side, there are sort of subdivisions of those modulations which relate to the corridors. So for the Nai-Ji, there's going to be perception modulation, as all mojos have, and discernment modulations. But for the Nai-Ji, the perceptions will be Nai modulated with Vi. Okay, the desire to speculate, inner visioning, conceptualizing, and so forth is modulated by the need to pay active attention to what's going on in the real world, active stimulus. So that's a necessary modulation so that one perception doesn't take over. Nai needs to be in charge, one must be the leader, but there must be an opposing perception, and all the mojos are designed like this in order to curb the lead perception. Okay, then there's also discernments. For the Nai-Ji, the top discernment is the Ji, and then the under discernment is the Zai. So the objective values-based discernment is modulated by the adaptive, subjective, logic-based discernment of Zai. And that again is because the structuring nature of Ji is very good, but it will continue to make values-based, objective structures and decisions and so forth at the expense of everything else. So the psyche is wired, as you mentioned before, to have a built-in counterbalance, a checks and balance system, as it were. So for the Nai-Ji, the desire to connect with other people, to feel acutely their emotions and what's going on with them and their mind, and also to feel some sort of connection to their story and what's happening with them. That needs to be curbed sometimes. That cannot be allowed to go, to infinite amounts. It can't be allowed infinite indulgence. So infinite indulgence is curbed through modulation, and with Ji, that is done with Zai. So we have the perception modulation, Nai with Vi, Nai over Vi, and we have the discernment modulation, which is Ji over the Zai. One more subdivision, sort of is layering within that, or over that, is major modulation and minor modulation. So Nai with Vi is the perception modulation because that is the perception corridor. It's also the major modulation, and that's because it is the fourth placed Vi, the weakest of the conscious powers for a Nai-Ji, is modulating the big boy, the big kid, the big girl, whatever you want to call it, but the Nai, the first power, the source power. So those perceptions are the top, and so it's being modulated by the weakest of the polars. So that takes the most active effort, willpower, discipline, maturity. Then for the Nai-Ji, you have the discernment modulation of Ji with Zai, but that's also what we call the minor modulation. And that is because, in this case, the Ji is the tandem power, the second place power, and it's being controlled, modulated, matured, disciplined with Zai, the third rank, the offside power. So, for example, the Ji Nai actually has the same perception modulation and same discernment modulation as the Nai-Ji, but the major and minor will be flipped. Finally, as a Nai-Ji, that means our conscious powers are Nai, Ji, Zai, Vi, but it also says what our unconscious powers, and those are going to be the Ni and Jai, and over here the Z and the Vi. Those are unconscious four powers, and it relates a lot to our inspiration, our inner genius, and the way we have to approach our unconscious in order to get it to dialogue with us, and the kind of gifts it will give us, which are awesome, by the way. And I think that's pretty much it for talking about the Nai-Ji and how the human design relates to it. Next up is 5 gears for the Nai-Ji, so stay tuned.